the next real issue that the United States faces in the post 9/11 world that's somewhat connected to 9/11 but not really. I mean, it seems like everything post 9/11 is 9/11 related, but the next other issue besides the war on terror and besides 9/11 that the United States faces is going to be a severe economic recession that hits in 2008. And also just the very controversial politics that start to happen where politics seem to be more divisive than ever. Kind of beginning with the Obama presidency, and continuing on. So we're going to talk a lot about like politics and economics in this lecture here, which can sometimes not be the most titillating thing on the planet, but it is very important because it shows that a lot of the problems that the United States still faces trace back several decades prior to when it seems like they might have started. But the first big problem that isn't 9/11 that the United States faces after the Cold War is going to be an economic recession that hits in 2008. And part of the reason why it hits in 2008 is because there is a big bubble that bursts in the economy, known as the dot-com bubble. And what happens was, the stock market, people invest in stuff, they buy stocks, they like that type of stuff. Um, in the early 2000s, the dot-com stuff was big. It was new, websites, internet, computers. Ooh, it was all fancy new technology. So people invested in it quite a bit. Um, and there had been peaks and troughs, where it was worth tons of money and then all of a sudden it wasn't. But in the early 2000s, before 2008, um, it had been growing again. Like there was a bubble growing in the economy where everybody was investing in all of this new technology like computers and whatnot. But how the stock market tends to work is that the more something becomes worth something, um, once it reaches a certain worth point, people start to get scared that it's not going to keep going up and they want to sell their stocks before the value goes down. And when too many people sell at once, it bottoms out, it becomes worthless, and all of a sudden the economy is bad. But what happens is that there had been a dot-com bubble in the early 2000s that had happened where people had invested a lot in new technology and then they get scared that it's not going to keep the value of these stocks, these technology stocks are not going to keep going up, so they sell off and everybody panics. So when that happened in the early 2000s, the federal government decided that things are not going so well. So what they did was they lowered interest rates. Woo hoo hoo, my goodness, everybody sit down. Talk about lowered interest rates. Wow. Um, the interest rates, when the federal government lowers interest rates, what that means is that they tell banks that you can't charge very, very high interest on loans. The reason the government does this is because they want the banks to give out loans and they want people to be able to afford the loans. You can't afford a loan if you have to pay like 10% interest on it. It becomes you're paying so much in interest that you can never really pay it all off. So when the federal government lowers interest rates, they make it much more affordable for people to do things like take out mortgages and buy homes because they want them to do it. When the economy's bad, they hope to stimulate it, get people spending money and doing stuff again, making jobs and investing. So when rates are low, when interest rates are low, that is because the federal government is really desperate for people to start taking out loans, buying houses, moving things along, getting things going again. And that's exactly what happens in the early 2000s. You can see by some of these, my lovely graph here, the dot-com market peaks in the early 2000s, then there's a crash, and the federal government says, let's lower interest rates. People are scared, they're not doing much economically. Let's try to help them along. So a lot of people want to take out a mortgage because they think that, wow, we can afford it now because I'm not paying as much interest. You take out a loan for a $200,000 mortgage and you're only paying 2% interest instead of maybe 8%. That's pretty good. People want that. So those low interest rates for taking out loans leads to a lot more Americans buying homes. And unfortunately, a lot of banks also engage in a practice called lending out subprime mortgages, which is when a bank lends the money, they give a loan to someone who can really feasibly never, ever, ever repay it. They just simply don't make enough money per month. If your income is $2,000 a month and your mortgage payment is $3,000 a month, the math isn't going to math for very long. And you're just not going to be able to pay that off. But and this is all leading up to what happens in 2008, because this is all pre-2008. I'm trying to, set the stage for you here. Why there's going to be such a big problem in 2008 is because of a big part of it is these subprime mortgages. Banks are lending out money to people who lack the income to meet monthly payments to actually pay for their homes. But the banks aren't doing this because they're not intelligent. The banks are not like, oh, okay, we'll just give you a loan. They're doing it on purpose. A lot of the banks are doing this because there is so much of a demand for houses that the banks think that they can just foreclose on anybody's home. Like if you can't make the payments, so what? Doesn't matter to us if you can't make the payments. We'll foreclose, we'll take the house back, and we'll sell it at a profit because there's such a huge demand for houses because of those low interest rates. Everybody wants a house. The housing market is frantic in the early 2000s. There's also a huge growth in home construction to meet this demand as well. You can't just rely on foreclosed houses to have enough stock. There's a demand for houses, so people are building them. However, this starts to create a housing bubble because suddenly there's more and more and more houses on the market. And basic economics, when there's a lot more of something, it becomes less valuable because if there's plenty of them, nobody's competing for it. When there's only a few of something, it's really valuable because everybody wants something that has not a lot of stock. But when you have tons and tons of houses, there's plenty to choose from. Everybody has to lower their prices to make it competitive so you could actually sell a house. So the housing market had another bubble too, where there was a huge increase. Everybody suddenly wants a house. There's not enough of them, but now, oops, there are suddenly a lot more houses available because of the foreclosures due to the subprime mortgages and this boom in housing construction. And it is going to be this real estate market that does help trigger the 2008 recession. So remember, there was a little bit of a recession. Like there was a little bit of a bad economic period. That's why the federal government lowered interest rates. But their lowering of interest rates to help the economy has this long, profound effect at actually hurting it. So the housing market is now struggling. As you can see by this here too, the subprime mortgages, everybody is going to be, everything is connected. All these different things are very much connected. The Great Recession will be triggered in 2008 by a huge rise in defaults on mortgages, where people, when you default on your mortgage, it means you can't pay anymore. So the bank takes your house back, they foreclose it. And this leads to, of course, a lot more houses on the market. And it leads to just a lot of, poor situations for Americans because you have a lot of Americans who were given a subprime mortgage who thought that they might be able to make ends meet, that they might be able to, pull something off and make this happen, and they can't. So they had once been housed and now they are, suffering from potential homelessness because they can't they had a house, they couldn't make the payment, so now what are they supposed to do? Once the house is foreclosed, the bank is not going to make sure you have some place to go afterwards. That's not really their concern. So it does lead to a lot of trouble in that for Americans trying to find housing and to try to stay so that they can have somewhere to put their heads down at night. Um, what happens when this is too is that so there is a rise in defaults and mortgage payments. A lot more houses are being foreclosed. You can see the foreclosure rate in the United States is really, really high in 2008, 2009, 10. The recession kind of starts in 2008. But because of this, uh, the banks also decide to stop making loans because they are now unprofitable. Um, you the whole reason they were making all these loans was because they were thinking, well, if people can't pay them, we'll just sell the house and make money. But now that the housing market is collapsed because there's too many houses on the market, the banks don't do it anymore. So they stop making loans, and that really slows the economy down too. So the economy, the way people spend and make money, just really collapses because you have a lot of people that are not able to spend money or do anything because they can't even afford a house. And you have banks that are no longer making loans. And when they're not really making a lot of loans, a lot of banks stop doing this. That doesn't help the situation either. You've got a lot of, that doesn't encourage businesses to start because a lot of people, if you want to start a business, you need a loan. Not everybody has $200,000 lying around to start up a business. So it really does slow everything down. There's just not a lot of movement. And the country is considered in a recession where there is not a lot of money being moved around. There's not a lot of jobs. It's a very poor situation to be in. And of course, that ever-present stock market there declines as well. So people aren't getting as much out of that if you're an investor because, people have less money. They can't even afford to make their mortgage payments or get a house. So of course, they're not going to be putting all any money they do have into stocks. They're worried about buying food and maybe trying to get enough money to rent an apartment. Um, this period becomes known as the Great Recession because it almost mirrors the Great Depression in a lot of ways. You've got stock market decline, which has a ripple effect on everybody, even if you're not involved in the stock market. You know, the place you work for is heavily invested in the stock market. So they might lay off employees when they stop getting when the stock market goes down. Um, there's also a lot of bank failures and housing loss, very much similar along the similar lines of the Great Depression of the 1930s. The economy is in the same trough as it was in the 1930s here. As you can see here, like 1 in 10 Americans facing serious issues of access to housing. And while this happens, while the country is kind of muddling through this housing crisis and this very poor economy, people start to wonder who's to blame, and they do start looking at banks and people on Wall Street and people that move money around and that have a lot of prestige when it comes to finance, and think, could it be your fault? What caused this? Um, a lot of big banks get a lot of flack for things that led to this. A lot of bankers and investors are seen as con artists or people who just really didn't have the best interest of Americans at heart. That's a very predatory thing to do, to give out loans knowing full well that that person is never going to be able to make the payments, just kind of sitting and waiting for them to fail so that you can take their house back and sell it at a profit. Um, Americans hear about this more and more, and they really, the respect for banks and these big lending institutions like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and all those massive names, their reputations are just in the gutter. And there is also an event during this time, during 2008, that another thing that happens that is triggered by the collapse of the housing market that really seems to highlight and embody corruption in Wall Street and in big finance. And that's the revelation of investor Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. So what happened was Bernie Madoff was a big, well-known investor, which meant that people gave him money and trusted him to invest it really well for them. He would get a cut, but they would make money on their money. That's what happens when you have enough money, you can have your money make money for you. You invest it in high yield accounts and the stock market, and it pays dividends. You put $50 into stocks and the stocks make money, and all of a sudden you have $100. And if you're super wealthy, you can make money on your money. Like, you don't even have to do anything else. You can just have your money make money for you through investments. And Bernie Madoff helped very wealthy people do that. People would give him money to invest for them, and he would help them make profit on their money. He always seemed to know what stocks to buy and, what companies to invest in and all that fancy economic suit wearing stuff. But it turns out it was all a Ponzi scheme. And what a Ponzi scheme is a very sophisticated way of swindling people out of money. What happens in a Ponzi scheme is someone like Bernie Madoff will tell wealthy investor number one, give me your money. I will invest it really, really well for you, and I will make you money. And wealthy investor number one says, okay, Mr. Madoff, thank you. Then someone like Bernie Madoff goes to wealthy investor number two and says, give me your money. I will invest it really, really well for you and make you lots of money. And wealthy investor number two says, that sounds like a great idea, Mr. Madoff. Here's my money. But what Mr. Madoff does is instead of actually investing it, he takes investor number two's money and gives it to investor number one and says, look at how much money I made on your money. And there's no real investment going on. A Ponzi scheme relies on constantly having new investors cropping up that you can take their money and give it to the first person. Ponzi schemes usually collapse when you can't get new people in because you don't have a new influx of money. Bernie Madoff had been doing exactly that. He'd been luring in new investors. He had been taking their money, promising to invest it, but really he was paying off everybody else in this massive scheme he had going on. And when the economy starts to collapse in 2008, things go really poorly for him because people aren't investing anymore. He's not luring in new people. And it starts to come down. One of his sons actually blows the whistle on him and says they find out that this is what dad was up to. And it turns out that he had defrauded people out of over $50 billion. So many people, even average people that had tried to invest through Bernie Madoff, lose their entire life savings because the money was just going nowhere. It was going to other people to pay them off. And it's quite devastating for even some average people that are invested in this. But when this is revealed, it really just seems it hits at exactly the wrong time and it destroys the reputation of elite financiers and Wall Street bankers and just seems to really embody how corrupt and distant and aloof they are, and even just, that they're criminals. And when that happens in 2008, it really seems to hit home to a lot of people that everybody in charge of finance is just inept, inept and cruel. And the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme revelation just is the embodiment, the picture of this. So Wall Street corruption is seen as at an all-time high, and respect for Wall Street and bankers is at an all-time low. They were seen as 100% responsible for everything going wrong economically. Um, I think they were like some poll at the time that was done kind of ranked them below convicted felons on a trustworthiness scale. And the government response is also kind of, I don't want to say lackluster, but the government response to this economic problem in 2008 is it's nothing that Americans see as to be celebrated. A lot of them are very let down by the government response. It's seen as kind of misguided. When a lot of banks and insurance companies almost go bankrupt during this, when they lose a lot of money and they don't really have enough to continue operating, the federal government bails them out, which means they use taxpayer money to make sure that big banks and big insurance companies don't shut down. The reason they do this is because they feel like that would wreck everything. I mean, if your bank shuts down, you lose everything. You have to have these businesses going. They felt like if they saved the big people up top, event that meant that they were saving everybody below. But a lot of Americans saw it as, that they were, they had done nothing wrong. They were not corrupt. They were not bad at managing money, and yet somehow their taxpayer dollars were going to bail out these big irresponsible banks and corporations that had just thrown money around, and now the government was coming in to save them, and nobody had come in to save the average American when the economy went bad and their home was foreclosed. You can see here someone going to the bank for a loan. It turns out the bank needs a loan from you because the bank mismanaged its money. And now that the economy was poor, they are looking to the taxpayer to help solve the problem. The federal government issued something called TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. And this is when they dump $700 billion into giant corporations like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and auto manufacturers, places like Citigroup, Bank of America, to give them money in order to make sure that they don't shut down. But Americans felt like they were indeed paying for these irresponsible institutions to keep going. They hadn't planned well, and now they're getting free money. And it seemed to the fact that the government didn't have the means to help everybody, especially not, the little guy, the average American, seemed to show the limits of the American safety net. There's a lot of people didn't qualify for unemployment or if they did, it wasn't enough. And a lot of assistance programs like food stamps or supplemental nutrition or state aid wasn't really going to cover it. So it felt like all of these things that seemed to be a safety net, like, oh, don't worry, if you're unemployed, you can go on unemployment, it's not going to cover the bills. It's not going to make ends meet. It turned out there was a lot less of a safety net than a lot of Americans had initially relied on. So it kind of shakes the foundation of how Americans felt like their government was protecting them. And it turns out they really weren't. Or it turns out that they weren't able to, especially at a scale this large, when there's so much economic downturn, so many people with homes being foreclosed, so many people out of jobs that they can't keep up. Like maybe the safety net only works when a smaller percentage of the population is suffering. But when you have a larger percentage of the population that needs aid, it turns out that that government aid can't keep up. And on this scene in 2008, there is a presidential election going on. One of the candidates is Barack Obama. He was a senator from Illinois and had served in the US Senate in 2004. And he gained fame as a very strong public speaker, very charismatic. He was a very good writer, and people liked to hear Obama talk because he had an interesting background. He was the product of an interracial marriage between a white woman and a Kenyan immigrant, and he had spent time living in Indonesia. His mother was an anthropologist. Then he lived in Hawaii, so he was all over. He had a very interesting background, and people were fascinated by it, and they kind of liked hearing him talk about it. And he seemed like a very community-minded kind of individual. And in 2008, when they were getting ready for the presidential election people were looking for in 2008, he ends up being the Democratic nominee for president. He beats Hillary Clinton, who had been um, Bill Clinton's wife. But so it was considered a very historic election. I remember this too because I'm old. But I remember this quite well. It was seen as no matter who won the Democratic nominee, it was going to be historic because you were either going to have the first woman or the first African American. And it turned out that it was going to be the first African American because he won the nomination. But in the election of 2008, Barack Obama is up against John McCain, who was a uh, he was a from Arizona. He was an Arizona senator. And John McCain ends up losing this election for several reasons. Part of it is because Obama was considered very charismatic. He had campaigned on a promise of bringing change, and that one word, change, was in all his posters. And Americans loved it because they were not happy with the government, they were not happy with the society, the economy, Bernie Madoff, they were mad at everything. And the promise of change seemed to be what they really wanted and what they needed. But John McCain's loss was also attributed to his connection with George Bush. He was endorsed by George Bush, who was the previous president before Obama. And George Bush had been so unpopular by that point that a lot of people think that George Bush's endorsement alone was enough to sink John McCain. Bush was unpopular from the war in Iraq, Hurricane Katrina, um, and it was seen as like, okay, if we have McCain, he'll just be a continuation of Bush. So that didn't help John McCain, but his loss was also attributed to his running mate. It was a woman named Sarah Palin from Alaska. She was seen as kind of a tactic to win over women voters. I don't know. I remember that too. A lot of people kind of wrote her off as well, like, well, they're just trying to get the woman vote because, if they're up against an African American man, they have to have something. So it wasn't even seen as she wasn't seen as a very competent politician. She was seen as just kind of paying lip service to get the female vote. Um, and she had a very bad habit of doing things that were easy to make fun of. Like she would say certain things and she had a certain way about her that was very easy to lampoon. Very, very well known for being kind of mocked mercilessly on Saturday Night Live. She had a very strong resemblance to the comedian Tina Fey, who was, again, quite merciless at making fun of her. But she was seen as not a very strong political candidate as a choice for his running mate to be vice president. Even just being from Alaska, a lot of Americans, like New Yorkers, were thinking, what does an Alaskan know about continental politics? So a lot of these factors together just didn't help McCain's case here, his campaign. And Barack Obama fairly handily won the election of 2008. And like any president, you have to have some policies, some platforms, some things that you want to do. One of the things that Obama was faced with immediately upon taking office was, of course, the bad economy, the Great Recession, and people not spending any money because, they're worried about losing their homes. And they don't trust the stock market either, really. Bernie Madoff kind of wrecked that one. But Obama hoped that by giving people money, that would stimulate the economy, like get them moving again, buy stuff that makes jobs, that gets everything going. So there was economic stimulus checks that went out, which was basically you just were given some money and told spend it. Um, and there is about $800 billion in money sent out to people, but also to try to pay for things like infrastructure, building bridges, very much like Franklin Roosevelt with the New Deal, trying to literally create jobs by giving people things to do that needed to be done, like build hospitals and bridges and whatnot. Um, and some people, of course, almost everything done since, I don't know, 1990 on is controversial. It's one of those things where it's split along political lines. Some people felt that the economic stimulus that Obama was doing was good. Some people felt it was just government handouts. Obama was also faced with a number of environmental issues. There was a uh, oil rig that exploded off the Gulf of Mexico that spewed oil all over the coast and killed a lot of wildlife. And it was cause for a lot of alarm and a lot of calls to put more heavy regulation on the oil industry. But it was very difficult to do that because in an economic recession, more regulation is seen as not helping make jobs or make people want to develop things or grow. But probably one of the most divisive, I suppose, things of the Obama presidency was his attempt to revolutionize healthcare and bring about something called the Affordable Care Act, which is given the nickname Obamacare because it was under his auspices. They're the same thing. If you hear Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, they're interchangeable. The official name is the Affordable Care Act or ACA, and that's what a lot of the supporters of it call. People who don't like it tend to just write it off as Obamacare because it was seen as something that Obama just pushed through without a lot of oversight or opinions or um you know or kind of consultation with others. Um and it really it's something that Obama had made it one of his platforms that like one of his things. So, presidents seem to choose like one or two big things they come into office wanting to change. Sometimes it's foreign policy, domestic policy. In this case, for Obama, it was healthcare and access to health insurance. And Obama had wanted to make sure that a lot of uninsured Americans could get insurance, that health insurance should be more affordable, that health insurance companies shouldn't be so predatory, or that they couldn't kind of deny people health insurance because of existing illnesses. Um, but what the Affordable Care Act does was it made it mandatory to have health insurance, and it created health insurance plans that were supposed to be very, very affordable so that everybody could comply with the law. And businesses, if you were a company, you had to offer some type of health insurance to your employees. The supporters of Obamacare really lauded it as creating affordable health insurance and thinking of something that would really help American people. Like that's something that they would feel that would give them more access to health care, that would encourage people to actually go to the doctor when they needed it, um, and that it would be felt by the average citizen. Whereas critics of it really just ripped it apart as a government takeover of private insurance companies. You don't like, not liking the size of government growing even more powerful and moving around even more money. And a lot of the other criticism was that it didn't quite live up to its promises. A lot of Republicans derided Obamacare as very inept, very bloated, very expensive. A lot of insurance companies were able to kind of twist it in their favor, I suppose. I'm one of the health insurance is one of those things that I don't think anybody truly understands. but many Americans were disappointed by the fact that it made it hard for them to keep a doctor or a plan that they had already had, and they felt that they had been lied to by this. So some people see benefits from it, others do not, and it does remain a very controversial topic, the idea of government involved in healthcare. Should the government even have anything to do with that, or should it all be private? Should it be between you and your doctor? These are questions I don't frankly want to answer or really even talk about because health insurance makes my stomach hurt. Um, but it is something that is it plagues the Obama presidency, is his attempts to craft some type of consistent, logical health insurance program for Americans and the controversy over the attempts to do so. Other issues that went on during the 2000s into the 2010s, there was still a lot of financial problems and a continuing, growing, burning hatred, really, for Wall Street. Ever since the Bernie Madoff thing, ever since the dot-com bubble burst, ever since the recession of 2008 and the revelation of all those subprime mortgages, there was a strong ire for elite financial people. The sense that they were the 1%, that they were a very, very small minority of the population that had control over everything. And everybody else, the 99%, with a lot less of the wealth, suffered because of it. And in 2011, that growing divide between the 1% with all the money and the 99% of the population without all the money and the power seemed to explode onto the into the public eye once again because it's been years since the 2008 recession and people are still feeling the effects of it. And in 2011, a group of protesters calling themselves the Occupy Wall Street movement, and sometimes there's a couple other names they give themselves, but it's generally considered the Occupy Wall Street movement. They decide that they are going to literally occupy Wall Street. They're going to sit there and be a presence and make their unhappiness with finances known. Area near Wall Street that they occupy is Zuccotti Park, and they really want to raise awareness for wealth disparities, wealth gaps, and how much money big corporations have and how much political power big corporations have. They felt that big companies could afford, because they were so wealthy, to hire lobbyists, political influencers who would push for things that were favorable for big companies and not necessarily for the average American. A lot of the protesters had signs like this. They felt that corporations and the government were corrupt, all working together to hoard the money like a dragon. Uh, and that it was, lobbyists hired by these big companies that were whispering in the ears of politicians and making decisions that didn't benefit average Americans. Um, and if you couldn't afford a lobbyist, if you're not a big corporation, it was too bad for you. So they really do occupy Wall Street. This was in the news for a really long time because they were determined to sit there every day with signs until they got their wishes. A lot of them were things like raising minimum wage, reducing the amount of political power and campaign donations that corporations could make, things that they felt would benefit just average citizens, not a, wealthy CEO of an automobile company or something like that. So this is something else just going on in a very political issue going on in this time. But it's not just domestic problems like the Affordable Care Act and the Occupy Wall Street movement that's going on under the Obama presidency. There are a lot of things that are going on in the foreign relations realm during the Obama years. Um, a lot of, surprisingly to a lot of Americans, a lot of what Obama did in the war on terror, which is, of course, was still going on, it doesn't just end when Bush leaves office. A lot of what goes on in the war on terror with Obama is kind of a continuation of what had been going on under George Bush. Under Obama, the number of troops in Afghanistan are actually increased. Um, Obama continued to expand the Patriot Act that allowed for more surveillance of Americans, and even sent in an airstrike that overthrew a dictator in Libya that was seen as another potential breeding ground for terror. One of the things that Obama was celebrated for, though, was he authorized a raid into Pakistan to find Osama bin Laden, and it was successful. Um, as you can see by the Washington Post article here, Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011, and Obama was quite pleased to say that justice has been done, meaning for what happened in 9/11. Um, so it was, the war on terror was still definitely going on. It was not just completely shut off during the Obama presidency. Although in 2011-ish, Obama does drastically reduce the amount of troops in Iraq because that conflict in particular had been just so unpopular and expensive. And he is kind of given the credit for finally pulling the plug on the continued presence of U.S. troops in Iraq. Foreign policy wise, Obama also kind of under his auspices, there is a Cuban thaw. The United States had been really at odds with Cuba since the Cold War, mostly because Cuba was communist and had sided with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Um, and Obama decides, you know what, the Cold War is over, so why are we still treating Cuba like it is the Cold War? So he tries to kind of start working more diplomatically with Cuba again, and um, I think he's the first president to visit Cuba since 1928. So this was seen as another positive for a foreign policy move for Obama. Um, Something that really also signaled that the Cold War was well and truly, finally, fully over. 2014, it's time to really be done with the Cold War for once and for all. But one of those other things that really kind of got Obama in some trouble during his time in office was the fact that he had increased quite heavily the reach of government surveillance with the Patriot Act. And in 2013, a former employee of the National Security Agency, the NSA, named Edward Snowden, kind of leaks a bunch of documents that showed that the government was surveying its citizens and other people, other world leaders, to an extent that nobody had even been able to, comprehend. That, his surveillance leak shows that, cell phones, computers, everything is tracking everything everybody does, that the government has reams and reams of information on its citizens that supposedly it's tracking them because it wants to stop terror attacks before they happen. But a lot of people being surveyed are like not even vaguely suspected of being terrorists. Um, the United States is monitoring a lot of private communications, and a lot of people felt that this was a violation of a civil liberty of privacy, that your civil liberties about, just having freedom of speech and being able to have a private life was being violated. But some people were still citing the fact that it was indeed the whole impetus behind this in the first place was to preserve national security and protect Americans. So that debate was and still is going on about what is the healthy balance between these two things. How much surveillance should be done of citizens for national security, and how much is too much? How much is a violation of people's right to privacy, of a right to have a private life without interference of the government? And Edward Snowden's whistleblowing on the NSA spying on people is immortalized in movies like this, and you can read about it. There's a lot of stuff like the Snowden case. It really brings to the forefront a very political issue. A lot of these things sort of divide people politically. If you agree with it or not, depends on your own political philosophies as well about what you think is the right path here. Um, Another political issue brewing is the extreme partisan politics. Uh, During and post Obama. Partisan politics usually means that people are divided amongst Democrats and Republicans and they just hate each other. Like it's very divisive, it's very controversial. There's so much bad blood. And nobody can really agree on anything. That's when you hear in the news, when you hear about bipartisan support, it's like both parties support something. Partisan is like party politics. I think that's where the term partisan even comes from. Partisan means like parties, political parties. So the strong split of partisan sense is very easy to see during this time. There's not a lot of commonalities between Democrats and Republicans. They really seem very, very divided. Um, they seem to have nothing in common. A lot of just really despising each other. And during the Obama presidency, a lot of Republicans really grow to be very partisan and grow to dislike Obama and the Democrat Party as well. And a lot of the foreign and domestic issues that crop up during Obama's presidency really galvanizes a lot of support for Republicans because they feel that they can, blame a lot on Obama and the Democrats, anything that's still going on wrong in the world. And that seems to be how anything goes anymore, really. Anything going on in the world is you blame whoever's in power or, blame whatever political party you don't like. And that really is exacerbated during the Obama presidency. The Obama years see the emergence of a group known as the Tea Party, which is a very grassroots, meaning people themselves did it, politicians didn't think of it and recruit people. It starts from the ground up. It's a grassroots conservative opposition to the Obama administration by a lot of very conservative or more right-leaning, i.e., Republican conservative Americans. And the big political divides for people, the things that really were turning people off to Obama and the Democratic Party, was a sense that Obama and Democrats had spent too much money, that they were overtaxing people to pay for things like the Affordable Care Act. And as you can see here, this woman is very, very happy with her creative little sign. Taxed enough already, no more spending, things like this. The Tea Party gets its name from the Boston Tea Party. The idea that, when the government doesn't do what you want, that you should do something drastic to show your opposition. And it and it's also just traced back to the fact that it was taxation that played such a heavy role in the American Revolution. Americans, colonists felt overtaxed by the British Empire. They didn't like that they were being taxed without representation. They threw the tea in the harbor to protest it. Americans are throwing metaphorical tea in the harbor now. They're protesting heavy taxation policies to show their dislike for what's going on in the country. So the country really is split down the middle politically. Not a lot gets done in the Obama presidency after his midterm elections, his first term in office, because there's so much conservative opposition to it that it's just kind of at a deadlock, and there's really not a lot that can, not a lot of bills that can get passed and whatnot. And in 2012, the election of 2012 is an election year, and Obama is up for re-election. The stakes are very high because people are worried about the economy, they're worried about high taxation, and his political opponent was Mitt Romney, who is a Republican from Massachusetts. He'd been a Massachusetts governor. And the result is pretty telling because even though Obama is the incumbent, already in office, that usually tends to sway people in their direction, he doesn't win by a landslide. In the popular vote, Obama only wins 51%. That is not a huge swath. I mean, that's a majority, but it's not a landslide. I mean, you've seen this map up on my slides before many times. Sometimes when someone wins office, like the whole map will be blue or the whole map will be red. In this case, it's really divided. And Obama doesn't win in a landslide majority. And it's seen as very telling of the times about how politically divided Americans are, where you have the country split almost 50-50. There is not a massive swell of support for one person or the other. Democrats support one person, Republicans support the other, and the two don't really ever meet. Um, and it is, you don't really see too many landslide elections after 2012. So the election of 2012, when Obama is reelected by a small margin, is seen as kind of setting a a trend, really, where politics are very divisive and you don't really see a landslide elections anymore for a politician. The country just seems to be very split. The other thing that the election of 2012 seems to solidify is that political elections are just wild. That they are going to be crazy campaigns, tons of money being spent. The entire election year is always going to be just a madhouse, and that's indeed how 2012 is. The entire year, the elections are not until November, but like beginning the year before and stretching the entire election year, it's just a nonstop barrage on TV of political ads. Ads are everywhere. The campaigning is so vigorous in this era, and it's also just very costly. Um, the record 20 the election of 2012 sets the record for how expensive campaigning for office is. How much money politicians dump into trying to get you to vote for them. Democrats and Republicans, both together in 2012, spent about $6 billion campaigning. That's like, that's unheard of till this time. Things like buying TV ads, traveling around to like wave at people on stage and give talks, and those little lawn signs that people stick in their yard. They dump so much money into this that it does set a new trend for incredibly expensive, costly elections. The election of 2024 tops that at 16 billion, that's billion with a B, dollars spent on campaigning. So you can see here, this is kind of the beginning of another era of American history, especially American political history, where you have a a new trend of increasingly divisive elections, increasingly contested and contentious elections, and increasingly expensive ones that cost quite a bit of money when it comes to campaigning.